The destiny of Western civilization was in jeopardy in the gloomy and bitterly cold December of 1940, and it was deteriorating hour by hour. In the sky, the War of Britain had been won. In the streets, however, the Blitz was in full swing. The city of London was on fire. The industrial heartlands of Liverpool and Coventry were being bombarded by the Luftwaffe. The British Empire still appeared to be enormous on the global map. A quarter of the world is covered with pink. However, the individuals in charge of the British government understood a horrifying truth within Whitehall's war chambers that they dared not share with the public. In addition to losing men, the empire was also losing money. One of Winston Churchill's most significant letters was written as he was seated at his desk in the subterranean cabinet war chambers. Churchill's voice was inspiring the free world. It was written to U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Churchill could use a phrase as a weapon because he was a master of the English language. However, he was required to do a delicate and degrading dance in this letter. He had to inform the world's richest neutral nation and its leader that Great Britain, the 19th century lender, the world's workshop, and the empire that had vanquished Napoleon was absolutely bankrupt. The letter was lengthy and comprehensive. The geopolitical position, the U-boat menace in the Atlantic, and the urgent need for planes and destroyers were all discussed. The story, however, was the sting. According to Churchill, the day was coming when the British Treasury would be unable to pay cash for the necessities of life. He said that although the British would engage in combat on the beaches and landing areas, they would be unable to fight without ammunition since they were no longer able to purchase it. It was an appeal to live. It was an acknowledgement of bankruptcy. We must examine the brutal economics of total war in order to comprehend how the richest empire in history came to be so impoverished. Britain was still a financial powerhouse when the war broke out in September 1939. It had gold deposits worth billions of dollars. It had an enormous foreign investment portfolio. British nationals controlled extensive industrial enterprises in the United States, railroads in Argentina, and copper mines in Chile. London served as the center of international shipping and insurance. Hitler's war, however, was not like any other war that had been fought. It was a machine war. The pace at which it devoured rubber, steel, oil, and aluminum was more than any pre-war estimate. Crucially, practically everything had to be imported by Britain. Britain was no longer able to trade with its neighbors due to the European continent's embargo. For survival, it had to look to the United States on the other side of the Atlantic. The United States was formally neutral at this point in the conflict. The American people had an isolationist mindset. They were resolved not to be drawn into another overseas carnage after recalling how American boys had perished in European mud during World War I. In order to prevent America from entering the war, Congress created the neutrality statutes. A particular provision known as cash and carry was included in these measures. According to the cash and carry regulation, belligerent countries like Britain may purchase American goods, but they had to transport them on their own ships and pay for them in cash right away. There wouldn't be any credit or loans. The Americans were pleased to sell the military weapons, but before the containers could leave the New York pier, they insisted on receiving gold on the barrelhead. In order to satisfy these demands, Britain spent its entire treasury during the first year of the war. They sold off their gold holdings. The British government placed all of the country's gold treasure aboard battleships and fastliners and transported it over the perilous Atlantic to vaults in Canada in a covert operation known as Operation Fish. It was the biggest physical wealth transfer in history. To pay the American debt collectors, billions of dollars worth of gold bars and negotiable securities were transported into exile. The gold was gone before the end of 1940. There was no more liquid cash. Contracts for the purchase of aircraft and tanks were sitting on the desks of the British Purchasing Commission in Washington, but it was unable to sign them because Treasury officials in London informed them that there were no funds available to honor them. Roosevelt was aware of the stakes when he received Churchill's letter. He was aware that the United States would be the next to fall if Britain did. However, he also had a political issue. He couldn't just hand Britain money. The American public would be incensed since it was illegal under American law. He sought a means of aiding Britain that seemed to be a firm commercial agreement rather than a charitable donation. He had to persuade American taxpayers to support the military effort. This is the origin of the Lend-Lease concept. Roosevelt used a folksy example to convey it to the media. He advised against haggling with your neighbor over the cost of a garden hose if his house is on fire. When the fire is out, he returns the hose you lent him. It seemed easy. It sounded abundant. It sounded like a helpful neighborly gesture. However, the actuality of the conversations that were held in Washington behind closed doors was very different. It was not a neighborly talk. A bank and a bankrupt customer were involved in a foreclosure case. Henry Morgenthau Jr. was the head of the U.S. Treasury. He was a fervent anti-fascist who wished to assist Britain in overthrowing Hitler. However, he also served as the American taxpayers' protector. He felt that Britain had to demonstrate that it had depleted itself of all its resources before the United States would offer a single penny in help. Morgenthau ordered a thorough examination of the British Empire to ensure that no money was being hidden by the British. He insisted on seeing a list of all the assets that the British government and individual British residents possessed worldwide. He wanted to know the worth of each piece of stock, each woolen sock, and each shell casing. Sir Frederick Phillips and the other British negotiators were taken aback. A foreign power was requesting that they open their books. They were being handled like a failing business in receivership rather than as allies against a shared foe. Phillips attempted to argue. Britain has already traded all its gold, he explained. He clarified that they would receive cents on the dollar if they sold their long-term investments during a conflict, which would be a fire sale. He said that depriving Britain of her foreign earnings would leave the nation penniless after the war, unable to reconstruct its towns or feed its people. Morgenthau still unconvinced. The president gave him explicit instructions. The United States refused to help until Britain had exhausted all other options. The reasoning was harsh. Why should American taxpayers pay for the war if Britain still had assets in the U.S.? If a British lord still controlled a factory in New Jersey, why should an Iowa farmer foot the bill for a British Army tank? The American Viscose Corporation case was the most agonizing representation of this forced liquidation. American Viscose was a huge industrial conglomerate. It was the biggest producer of artificial silk and rayon in the U.S. Coles, a British firm, owned it. It was the crown gem of British foreign investment. With annual profits of millions of dollars, it was extremely successful and contributed to balancing the British trade imbalance by returning to London. The aim, according to Morgenthau, was American Viscose. He insisted that the British negotiators sell it. He requested that the proceeds from the sale be placed in the U.S. Treasury to cover the current arms orders. The British put up a fight. They were aware that the business was valued at more than $100 million. It would be financially disastrous to sell it quickly during a war, but Morgenthau had the power. Congress was working on the Lend-Lease measure. It was being attacked by isolationists who said that Britain was genuinely wealthy and was attempting to deceive America into paying its debts. Morgenthau required a lamb for sacrifice. He had to demonstrate to Congress that Britain was suffering. He issued an ultimatum to the British. The committee will decide whether to sell American Viscose or provide a lease. Under tremendous pressure from Washington, the British authorities took the American Viscose Corporation from its owner's courts on Sunday, March 15, 1941. They didn't request authorization. The emergency war powers were used to issue the mandatory purchase order. A team of U.S. investment bankers managed the transaction. Since everyone knew the British had to sell, the transaction was distressed. The bankers engaged in a ruthless negotiation. About $54 million was the sale price of the business. It was a theft. At least double that amount was the company's worth. In London, the British government had to pay Cordals back in pounds, which increased their own internal debt. The sale of American Viscose marked a turning point because the British elite grasped the actual cost of the unique connection, even if the proceeds flowed directly into the U.S. Treasury to purchase guns and aircraft engines. They weren't a couple. Their assets were being taken away from them as a junior entity in order to fund their existence. The British Empire's riches was being absorbed by the United States through contract rather than conquest. It wasn't limited to industrial assets either. The geopolitical underpinnings of the empire itself were also liquidated. Another agreement involving the Royal Navy was being negotiated as the finance negotiators argued over stock pricing. Britain needed destroyers badly. Merchant ships were being sunk by German hoboes more quickly than British shipyards could replenish them. North America's lifeline was being severed. Churchill pleaded for 50 outdated destroyers from Roosevelt. These were ships from the First World War that were mothballed in American Navy yards. They were outdated, rusted, and of little use to the U.S. Navy today. Roosevelt consented to hand them up to Britain, but at a cost. He didn't give them away for nothing. He exchanged them. The United States sought 99-year leases on a series of British air and naval sites across the Atlantic in return for 50 rusting ships. From the Bahamas, Jamaica, St. Lucia, Trinidad, British Guiana, and Newfoundland and Canada. Consider the size of that transaction. Britain provided the United States with a Western Hemisphere-wide strategic presence. They turned over the keys to the North Atlantic and the Caribbean. For 50 ancient ships that were hardly seaworthy, they let the United States to establish military installations on British sovereign land that would reflect American might for a century. It was a fire sale in geopolitics. In exchange for short-term tactical survival, Britain was giving up its long-term strategic advantages. Selling the family silver to get food was the behavior of a desperate country. Britain had been completely decontaminated by the time the Lend-Lease Act was eventually enacted in March 1941. The gold has vanished. The U.S. interests were being liquidated. They leased the bases. There was nothing in the British Treasury. Publicly, the Lend-Lease Act was heralded as the democratic arsenal. In many respects, it was a commendable gesture of unity as it was portrayed. It supplied the food, oil, tanks, and aircraft that kept Britain afloat. Without it, the British Isles would have probably been starved to death by the Nazis. However, the arrangement's financial parameters set the stage for a post-war world in which America would be the creditor and Britain would be the debtor. The assistance wasn't a gift, it was a lease. The fundamental presumption was that a reckoning would occur. Something would be taken into account. Article 7 was a provision in the Lend-Lease Agreement's language. A poison pill for the British Empire was included in a brief statement written in complex diplomatic terminology. It said that Britain would consent to abolish its imperial preference system following the war in exchange for the assistance. The economic barrier that kept the British Empire intact was imperial preference. Trade between Britain and her colonies, Canada, Australia, India, and South Africa, was facilitated by this tariff arrangement. This meant that British goods were less expensive than American ones in imperial markets. It was the system that kept British industry afloat in the face of increasingly effective American rivalry. Britain committed to dismantling its own economic defenses when it signed Article 7. They were consenting to allow American exporters inside their kingdom. They were signing their own trade bloc's death warrant. Article 7 was contested by the British negotiators. They had no option. Even though they knew it marked the death of the empire as a whole, the German bombers were in the air. The Atlantic was where the U-boat were. The money was gone. They put their signatures. The dynamics changed once more as 1941 evolved in 1942, and the U.S. formally joined the war following Pearl Harbor. America and Britain were now fighting alongside each other. The number of American soldiers in Britain surged. The U.S. Army Air Force used the island as a massive aircraft carrier. However, the gap in wealth merely widened. Government expenditure promoted the growth and efficiency of American manufacturing. Every year, the U.S. economy expanded by enormous percentages. Meanwhile, the war effort was cannibalizing and distorting Britain's economy. Britain ceased exporting. Every factory was transformed to produce goods for the war effort. It stopped selling in Asia and Latin America. And who entered such markets? American businesses, when Spitfires were being manufactured in British facilities. For the international market, American industries produced automobiles, radios, refrigerators, and Spitfires. In addition to fighting the war, the United States was robbing Britain of its commercial future. The transfer of wealth was complete by 1944. Fort Knox had replaced London as the location of the world's gold reserves. Across the Atlantic, the financial center of gravity had moved. However, the ultimate humiliation was still to come. The British thought their sacrifice would be respected. They thought that the Americans would be kind to them after the war because they had battled against Hitler alone for 2 years and had gone bankrupt to rescue the world. They anticipated that the Lend-Lease would last for a while. They thought the landing would be gentle. They were mistaken. The lesson of the Viscose sale had slipped their minds. They had forgotten that appreciation is not a commodity in the realm of high finance. The bill would be due as soon as the conflict was over, and what little British power left would be broken by the shock of that moment. The tale of how a country might win a war militarily, but lose it economically is known as the price of victory. In the process of defeating Germany, Britain had also defeated itself. It had sacrificed its future for its ally by using its history to protect its present. The news flashed throughout the world on August 15, 1945. Japan had given up. The Second World War was finished. In London, bonfires were lit as people gathered outside Buckingham Palace and chanted, "We want the king." In the streets, strangers gave each other hugs. It was an instance of pure, unadulterated happiness. The Axis power's despotism has been overthrown. The British Empire had triumphed when it stood by itself against the darkness. But there was no emotion in Washington, D.C., on the other side of the Atlantic. All that was present was a chilly bureaucratic machine that had been waiting for this precise time to change course. President Harry Truman signed a document that would destroy the British economy more thoroughly than any German bomb 7 days after the victory celebrations got underway. The order to stop the Lend-Lease was signed by him. The cutoff was swift and severe. It was unquestionable. According to the directive, all assistance ceased at that point. There was no time for transition. There was no grace period. American Liberty ships carrying wheat, beef, and tools headed for Liverpool were told to turn around and return to the United States in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The lifeline was cut off. Shock immobilized the British government. They had thought the assistance would keep helping them rebuild. They had believed that they would have time to adapt to peace once their economy had been totally restructured to fight a shared war. The renowned economist and government advisor, John Maynard Keynes, spotted the abyss when he examined the figures. Nearly all of Britain's basic resources and half of its food were imported. Lend-Lease monies were being used to pay for them. Britain would have gone bankrupt without the funds. Not in a month or a year, but right away. According to Keynes' calculations, Britain was in financial limbo. The nation would have to stop making payments. Food imports would have to end. It would be necessary to reduce the minimal meals that had been provided during the conflict to the point of hunger. There would be no raw materials available for the companies to use. Social collapse and vast unemployment would result. There was just one choice. Britain was forced to plead. John Maynard Keynes, who was near death, boarded a ship bound for Washington in September 1945. He had a cardiac ailment that would shortly take his life, and he was tired and sickly. Despite being the greatest economic thinker of the century, he was traveling to America as a supplicant rather than an intellectual. Keynes thought he had a moral argument. He intended to enter the U.S. Treasury and make the case that America had stayed neutral during the war, while Britain had fought it alone for 2 years. He would contend that in order to preserve Western civilization, Britain had given up its whole economy. In light of this, the United States ought to give Britain $6 billion as a gift or grant, not a loan, as restitution for the money and blood that Britain had expended maintaining the line. He referred to it as justice. However, he discovered that Americans did not value justice when he got to Washington. The atmosphere had shifted. The conflict had ended. The American people have had enough of footing the bill for Europe. The new Labour administration in Britain, which had recently been elected on a platform of socialism and nationalizing enterprises, aroused the suspicions of Congress politicians. They opposed funding a British socialist experiment with American capitalist tax monies. Hard-faced guys commanded by Fred Vincent were the American negotiators. Their eyes were icy as they gazed at Keynes. Sines was disappointed when they informed him straight out. There would be no gift. There would be no grant. There would only be a loan, and it would be a loan on commercial terms with interest. He quarreled. He begged. He cautioned them that they would lose a crucial partner in the fight against the Soviet Union's growing danger if they financially destroyed Britain. However, all the cards were in the American hands. They were aware that Britain had nowhere else to go. They made a $3.75 billion loan offer. It was just enough to get by, and it had strings connected to it, threads intended to choke off the last of the economic independence of the British Empire. Sterling convertibility was the most toxic condition. The Americans insisted that Britain make the pound sterling completely convertible within a year of obtaining the loan. This implied that anyone with British pounds might go to a bank anywhere in the globe and exchange them for US dollars. This was presented by the Americans as free commerce. In actuality, it was a means of breaking the sterling region, notwithstanding their claims that they wished to open up the world's markets. Britain had made its commercial partners and colonies take payments in pounds during the war, but they were not allowed to convert those pounds into dollars. Because their money was only valid in Britain, nations like Egypt, Australia, and India were compelled to purchase British products. British business was shielded by this tight loop. The goal of the Americans was to break that circle. They were aware that everyone who had pounds would sell them right away to purchase dollars if the pound were made convertible, since everyone preferred American products to British ones. American automobiles were superior, American refrigerators were superior, American machinery was superior. This state was a deadly trap, and Keynes knew it. He was aware that a run on the pound would occur as soon as convertibility was implemented, draining the loan in a matter of weeks. He battled it till his health failed. However, famine was the alternative. The British Parliament angrily and reluctantly decided to approve the loan. It was referred to as a financial Munich. To stay alive, they were making concessions to the Americans. In July 1946, the loan arrangement was signed. A few months later, Keynes passed away, his heart finally failing due to the strain of attempting to defend his nation from its closest ally. However, the catastrophe was only getting started. The 1947 winter was the coldest in recorded history. The nation was covered in snow due to blizzards. Stockpiles of coal went cold. Power plants shut off. Factories shut down. There was no electricity, so many shivered while burning candles in unheated homes. The British people realized the truth of the triumph in this icy, gloomy atmosphere. Despite winning the battle, their quality of life was rapidly declining. In times of peace, bread, which had never been rationed even during the worst of the U-boat blockade, was rationed. After the start of the austerity era, the American situation began to deteriorate. In accordance with the terms of the loan, Britain made the pound sterling fully convertible on July 15, 1947. The outcome was precisely what Keynes had anticipated. It was a bloodbath of finances. The world hurried to sell pounds as soon as the window opened. To get valuable US dollars, nations that had been hoarding sterling for years dumped it. The American loans funds, which were meant to endure for years, started to disappear. Britain lost hundreds of millions of dollars in a single month. The authorities watched in alarm as their reserves disappeared due to the severity of the bleeding. They were dying from bleeding. On August 20th, 1947, after just 5 weeks, the British government was compelled to halt convertibility. The window was slammed shut. They had to acknowledge their complete failure to the US Treasury. They had squandered a significant amount of the debt. It was utter humiliation. The British Empire was destroyed when it attempted to follow American rules. There were immediate geopolitical repercussions from this financial vulnerability. It was at this point that London formally handed over the reins of global authority to Washington. The US State Department received a covert communication from the British government in February 1947. It was a resignation message. Greece and Turkey had been protected by Britain for a century, preventing the Russians from entering the Mediterranean. But now that the treasury was empty, Britain was unable to support the Greek government or pay the soldiers. The telegram essentially said, "We are broke. We are leaving. If you want to stop the communists, you have to do it." This telegram triggered the Truman Doctrine. The United States stepped in to fill the vacuum. It was the formal acknowledgement that Britain was no longer a superpower capable of shaping global events. It was a regional power trying to keep the lights on. The economic misery dragged on. In 1949, with the economy still stagnant and the reserves low, the government was forced to devalue the pound. Before the war, the pound had been worth $4.86. In 1949, it was slashed to $2.80. Overnight, the British people became 30% poorer relative to the rest of the world. Imports became more expensive. The cost of living rose.